All right, in this last section, we're going to talk about the New England colonies. So, the English colonies in New England really were established from about 1620 onward, and they were kind of founded with loftier goals than they were in Virginia. Although migrants to New England expected kind of economic profit, religious motives really directed the rhetoric and much of the reality of these colonies. Not every English person who moved to New England during this time frame, the 17th century, the 1600s, was a Puritan, but Puritans dominate the politics and religion and culture of New England. I mean, even after 1700, the region's Puritan inheritance shapes a lot of the aspects of its histories. Now, the term Puritan kind of began as an insult, and its recipients usually referred to each other as the godly, as if they used a specific term at all. But Puritans believed that the Church of England did not distance itself far enough from the Catholicism of Henry VIII, or before he broke with Rome in the 1530s. And they largely agreed with European Calvinists, following the theologian John Calvin on matters of religious doctrine. Calvinists and Puritans believed that humankind was redeemed by God's grace alone, and that the fate of an individual's immortal soul was predestined. The happy minority that God had already chosen to save were known among English Puritans as the elect. So Calvinists argued that the decoration of churches, the reliance on ornate ceremony, the corrupt priesthood, obscured God's message. And they believed that reading the Bible was the only way to really understand God. They were stereotyped by their enemies as kind of killjoys, and the exaggeration has kind of endured. It is certainly true that the Puritans' disdain for excess and opposition to a lot of holidays that were popular in Europe, including Christmas, which Puritans never got tired of reminding everyone the Bible never told anyone to celebrate Jesus' birthday, lent themselves to kind of this caricature of just being no fun. But Puritans understood themselves as advocating a reasonable middle path in a corrupt world. They weren't as square as they kind of seemed, right? Like, it would have never occurred to a Puritan to abstain from alcohol or sex or anything like that. That maybe it had kind of been characterized as. During the first century, the English Reformation, so 1530 to 1630, the Puritans sought to purify the Church of England of all practices that reminded them of Catholicism, advocating for simpler worship service, the abolition of ornate churches, and other major reforms. They had some success in pushing the Church of England in a more Calvinist direction, but when you have the coronation of King Charles I, the Puritans gained a very difficult foe that cast English Puritans as excessive and dangerous. And so, facing these growing persecutions, the Puritans began the Great Migration, during which about 20,000 people traveled from New England between 1630 and 1640. The Puritans, unlike the small band of separatist pilgrims who founded the Plymouth colony, remained committed to reforming the Church of England, but temporarily kind of decamped to North America to accomplish that task. And you end up with leaders like John Winthrop, and who insists that they are not separating or abandoning England, but were rather forming a godly community in America that would be a city on a hill, and an example for reformers back home. The Puritans did not seek to create a haven of religious toleration. Don't think that at all. They were not religiously tolerant. They considered the notion of religious toleration was a notion that they, much like most European Christians, regarded as ridiculous and dangerous to just be tolerant. While the Puritans did not succeed in building a godly utopia in New England, a combination of Puritan traits and several external factors created colonies wildly different from any other region settled by English people. Unlike those who were going to Virginia, colonists in New England, like Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, Rhode Island, generally arrived in family groups. Most New England immigrants were small landholders, a class contemporary English called the middling sort, kind of the middle class. When they arrived in New England, they tended to replicate their home environments, founding towns composed of independent landholders. The New England climate and soil made large-scale plantation agriculture really impractical. So the system of large landholders using masses of slaves or indentured servants to grow labor-intensive crops never really took hold. But there's no evidence that the New England Puritans would have opposed that if it were possible. Other Puritans made their fortunes on Caribbean sugar islands, right? And they used lots of slaves. So nothing about being a Puritan was anti-slavery. New England merchants profited from suppliers and provisions of slaves to those colonies. So by accident of geography more than design, New England society really was less, stratified than other of Britain's 17th century colonies. Now, although New England colonies could boast wealthy landholding elites, the disparity of wealth in that region remained pretty narrow compared to like the Chesapeake or Carolina or the Caribbean. Instead, 1600 New England was characterized by broadly shared, modest prosperity based on mixed economic dependency of small farms and shops and fishing and lumber and shipbuilding and trade with the Atlantic world. A combination of environmental factors and Puritan social ethos really produces a region of remarkable health and stability during the 17th century. New England immigrants avoid most of the deadly outbreak of tropical disease that had turned the Chesapeake colonies into graveyards. Disease, in fact, only aided English settlement and relations to the Native Americans. In fact, or in contrast to other English colonists who had to contend with very powerful Native American population, many survivors of the biological catastrophe of smallpox that swept through, they kind of welcomed the English as potential allies against the rival tribes that had escaped the catastrophe. The relatively healthy environment, coupled with political stability and the predominance of family groups, allowed the New England population to grow to 91,000 people by 1700 from only like 21,000 immigrants. So in contrast, 120,000 English went to Chesapeake and only 85,000 white colonists remained by 1700. So they're growing and everywhere else is kind of shrinking and struggling. The New England Puritans set out to build their utopia by creating communities of the godly. Groups of men, often from the same region of England, applied to the colony's general court for land grants. They generally divided part of the land for immediate use while keeping much of the rest of it as commons or undivided land for future generations. The town's inhabitants collectively decided the size of each settler's home and how much their lot was, and that was based on their kind of current wealth and status. So besides oversight of property, the town really restricted membership. New arrivals needed to apply for admission. Those who gained admittance could participate in town government. So while not necessarily democratic by today's standards, at that point, it had very broad popular involvement. All male property owners could vote in town meetings and choose, selectmen, assessors, constables, other officials from amongst themselves to conduct the daily affairs of government. Upon their founding, towns would write covenants, reflecting the Puritan belief in God, God's covenant with his people. Towns sought to arbitrate disputes and contain strife, as did the church. Wayward and divergent individuals were persuaded or corrected or coerced, and popular conceptions of Puritans as hardened authoritarians are really exaggerated. But if persuasion and arbitration failed, people that didn't conform to the community norms were either punished or removed harshly. Massachusetts alone banished Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, and other religious dissenters like the Quakers. Although by many measures colonization in New England succeeded, the Puritan leaders did fail in their mission to create this utopian community. They tended to focus their disappointment on not being able to do that on the younger generation. And so they kind of just said, hey, if the younger people would get on board, we'd really be able to do what we set out to do. But it didn't stop their prosperity. As the population spread and grew more diverse, many, if not most, New Englanders retained very strong ties to their Calvinist roots in the 18th century. But the Puritans, who became kind of Congregationalists, struggled against the rising tide of religious pluralism. On December 25th, 1727, Judge Samuel Sewall noted in his diary that the Anglican minister keeps the day in his new church at Braintree. People flock thither. Previously forbidden holidays like Christmas were celebrated publicly in church and privately in homes. And Puritan divine Cotton Mather discovered on Christmas 1711 that a number of young ladies of both sexes, belonging many of them to my flock, had a frolic, a reveling fest, and a ball, which discovers their corruption. So, the young people are wanting to have a good time. I mean, they want to have a good time. Despite all of their lamentations, these Puritan leaders left an enduring mark on New England culture and society that endured long after the region was no longer considered just to be Puritan. And that kind of concludes our chapter 2. So make sure that you go back and kind of look through all of that and chapter 3.